Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the daily chart of gold price in euros, and I've drawn the ascending trend lines. You can see we get the beginning of the trend line back in the fall of 2008 at the height or depth, as you might say, of the financial crisis. Gold took it on the chin there for a little bit and then started to rally. You can see starting at the end of 2009 we started a sharper uptrend, and then finally here in the summer of last year we started on this next uptrend, and now hopefully we're on another spike. Now I posted a chart, this same chart, on my blog, noting that the price of gold in euros is within 96% of its all-time high. So you can see the all-time high here is about 1375 in euros, and you can see we're at about 1318, so that's roughly 96% of the all-time high. So obviously those folks in Europe who have been worried about the financial crises that are coming upon them and have been coming upon them for the last year or two, they've been quite wise to protect themselves with gold, and it certainly looks like it is looking to do another move up into new highs. Now the US gold chart is not as strong, and that's because the dollar has been strengthening. I'm going to address the strength of the dollar when I get into the main topic of the night, but it's still quite strong. Obviously, looking at the chart, there's no question that the bull market is still intact, even though we may have this little hiccup here, obviously reversed very rapidly. We still have the very large W that is formed, and hopefully we'll round up and continue higher. The silver chart, of course, silver being the most undervalued asset in the history of the world, silver is still quite a ways from even its intermediate term highs of the mid 40s, 44 or so. Of course, the high near 50. So at this price, of course, silver is an incredible bargain. Not to say it can't go lower. That just means it would be that much more of a bargain. Now I want to segue into a story here. I'm going to go ahead and stop bashing Greece and stop bashing Europe and start bashing America again. So I think I lost my reputation as a equal opportunity basher when I spent so much time recently with Europe. Of course, in my opinion, I actually believe, and I don't know if I've made this clear, but I haven't had the opportunity to post any of the Leap 2020 articles that are covered. I think they're quarterly, they come out, but I have a lot of respect for them. They've called a lot of things, and actually, if I haven't made it clear, I believe that the European countries are actually in a better fiscal situation and debt situation than the United States. I think the United States is the 8 million ton elephant in the room that is really going to be the biggest nuclear blowout bankruptcy in the history of the world. So I actually believe that the United States is in far worse shape than Europe, and actually probably far worse shape than even Greece. So let's dig into this article by the Sovereign Investor. I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. This pretty much summarizes how I feel about this. We've had the Obama budget that came out, and we've got Boehner on there, which is just an absolute joke. Now, anybody who has been following these people, and I've been saying for quite some time that these people have absolutely no intention whatsoever of cutting anything. These people are pathologically insane. They intend to run this train right off the tracks at full speed. They intend to run this ship into the iceberg, and I'm going to show you that when I read this article. This is from the Sovereign Investor, Bob Bauman. President Obama, in the scandalous show of bad faith and dereliction of his sworn duty, proposed a phony fiscal year 2013 budget plan this week that increases spending from 3.8 trillion in 2013 to 5.8 trillion in 2022. And by the way, just in Obama's defense here, I will say that it is not the president's job to put forth spending. It's actually delegated to the House of Representatives, who have been incredibly derelict in that duty. True to his New Deal socialist antecedents, the Obama budget will add to the bloated size and scope of the federal government and the national debt. Each American share of this debt is now $49,000. Here's a right-on comment about the Obama budget by Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer. Quote, "The president knows that we are headed over a cliff. He just wants to get past Election Day, as he does on everything. But this is a budget worthy of Greece, and for the President of the United States to offer it knowing how dire our situation is truly scandalous. If you spent like Obama, for a stunning revelation of what the $3.8 trillion Obama budget would mean in the understandable numbers of an average family who followed his example, see ABC News analysis by Jake Tapper. If your budget followed the Obama's example, it would mean a family budget as follows, with comparable Obama budget numbers at the right. Total family spending, $38,000. Total family income, $29,000. Total new debt, $9,000. Total existing credit card debt, $153,000. Quite obviously, no family could live like this, and neither can the United States for very much longer. Yet the president, who apparently thinks Americans are all ignorant dolts, told us he was cutting spending in his phony, I think he's meant to say, budget. Fat, phony budget, non-existent cuts. Cato Institute Dan Mitchell below cut through the fog to get at the truth of what Obama claimed was a $2 trillion budget cut in spending over 10 years. Quote, "We have a budget of almost $4 trillion, so if we're doing $2 trillion of cuts," Mitchell said, "we're cutting government in half. That sounds wonderful. But what the president was talking about is not even a cut. Obama just proposed that over the next 10 years, instead of increasing spending by 9.48 trillion, that increase it by just 7.3 trillion. Calling that a cut is nonsense." Mitchell gave an analogy. What if I came to you and said, "I've been on a diet for the last month and I've gained 10 pounds. Isn't that great?" You would say, "Wait, what are you talking about? That's insane." And I said, "I was going to gain 15 pounds, but I've only gained 10 pounds. Therefore, my diet is successful." Snouts in the feeding trough. A central problem is that Americans in every demographic group are increasingly getting government handouts. That makes it that much tougher for the weak-kneed politicians to cut spending. Add to the fact that half of all Americans pay no income taxes, so what do they care? According to the Census Bureau's data from the third quarter 2010, 49% of Americans live in a household receiving benefits from one or more federal or state programs. That's 148 million people out of a total population of 304 million. More than 1 in 3 Americans lived in households that receive Medicaid, food stamps, or other means-based government assistance. Now, if you remember when I talked about Greece, I talked about, being on the dole, taking money from the government, and you've got to realize that Greece is a very important message. If you watch what's happening there, you can see the message that's being sent, and that message is that it won't go on forever. So the austerity is going to come eventually, and that austerity is going to be cuts in these programs, whether it means cuts to government workers' pay, cuts to government workers' pensions, cuts to government assistance. Those cuts are going to come. So if you're getting money from the government, and I know I sound like a broken record, but if you're getting money from the government, then what you need to do is stop or plan an alternative. I don't make any judgments about somebody who's getting money from the government. more power to them. Maybe they can milk it out as long as they can. I don't know. But I can tell you this, it's going to get cut off. So it's probably better for you in the long run if you just simply live as if that didn't exist. Maybe you get some check. I don't know what check you could get. It could be SSI, it could be anything. I have no idea. You'd probably be better off just sticking that in some account somewhere and never even touching it and trying to survive without it, because eventually you're going to have to survive without it because we're bankrupt. So, continuing. The greased slide. Of course, Obama and the left want to go right on spending without making any real cuts or reforms. What they want is more taxes with the goal of redistributing income from those who pay taxes to those who don't. This is another cheap repeat of the old Roosevelt New Deal political plan of tax, spend, elect. Just take a look at the stark, revealing numbers about the U.S. government spending. Now, this chart that he posts here, I can't increase it because it goes to the same size when you click it, but you can see that basically the United States has gone from a 7.3%, this goes back to 1870, government spending as a percentage of GDP was about 7.3% back in 1870. You can see it had this rise until we got to about 1920. You know, the Federal Reserve was created in between those 2 years. We get into the Great Depression, we're at about 20%. Up in the 60s, we're 27%. We're pretty steady all the way up to 2000 until we get into Bush and then Obama, and we're now up to 42.2% of GDP is government spending. So where the number is of complete collapse, who knows? Now, of course, when we've criticized the Europeans, you can look at some of these other countries. We can see them in comparison here. I don't see Greece on this list, but a lot of these other countries are higher than the United States. So you would think, well, so what? That's not that big of a deal. Well, it is that big of a deal because many of these countries, and a lot of people have pointed out to me how Norway, when I was criticizing socialism, Norway has the highest standard of living. And, well, that ignores the fact that 30% of those revenues are generated by oil revenues that are coming from the oil wells that are controlled by the government. But even more important than that, the Norwegian government apparently, and something like the Alaskan government maybe, is responsible enough that they can mine these resources, sell them, do it at a reasonable rate, and book a profit and benefit their citizens. I have no criticism of that. If you want to have a mixed economy, go ahead. But the reality is, in the United States, this 42.2% of GDP that we're talking about that is government spending, this spending is a complete waste. This is broken window spending. This is digging a hole and filling it back up. This is blowing up things in other countries. This isn't what China's doing, which is building giant super fast trains and infrastructure. We're not building any infrastructure. The infrastructure that was proposed in the United States was ridiculous. The trains that they proposed were, you could drive a car faster than these trains. I mean, the bridges are falling apart, the cities are falling apart. So none of this 42.2% spending that we're spending on the government is going towards infrastructure. So even though these countries, I don't want to use the term responsible socialist countries, but at least the governments of these semi or mixed economy socialist countries are responsible and not corrupt in the sense that they're actually using it to benefit their citizens and build some infrastructure. So in that case, again, my vote has to be in favor of the European governments over the corrupt United States government. Now, we get a comparison here about to the Greek debt. Now compare U.S. and Greek deficits prompted by big spending politicians and selfish political demands, and you can see debt as a percentage of GDP. They're very similar there. The end is near. The plain truth is that the United States government is very close to bankruptcy, and the politicians of both parties who refuse to act to solve this national crisis are morally bankrupt. The final reckoning day is soon at hand, the day when China, Singapore, and all other investors stop propping up the U.S. then the game will end with a resounding crash. You think those riots in the streets of Athens can't happen here? Folks, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now, a lot of people talk about the Alex Jones type stories in FEMA camps, and there's no question that there is a police state mentality that has been growing since the 9/11 occurrences, and that's been growing steadily with the Department of Homeland Security, and there's rumors of all kinds of crazy stuff. But I really don't think that the things that are happening have anything to do with a lot of what they're describing. I think that what they're expecting, and they know what's coming, is that they're probably going to have to cut off an enormous number of people who are taking money from the government when the government goes broke. And they are expecting, I believe they're expecting, a tremendous amount of violence. Now, of course, I don't advocate violence. I think the violence in Greece was horrific, and I certainly don't advocate any violence in the United States. What I advocate is that you extricate yourself from dependence on the government. You put yourself in a position where you're able to help others, and hopefully, and I have a strong enough faith in the American people, I don't think that the violence they're expecting is going to happen. I really honestly don't. I think that America will go into another depression like it did in the last depression. And you saw some violence. You can look up the footage of some of the riots and protests. But for the most part, there wasn't violence in the last Great Depression. And I really honestly don't think there will be violence in this next one. I think they've underestimated the American people. And I think the vast majority of Americans are law-abiding citizens, and they probably will reach out to help each other rather than try to destroy each other. That's just my opinion. When that happens, and at this rate, it won't take a decade, U.S. Treasury bonds and Washington's credit rating will be worth little more than those faked document piles of subprime mortgages issued by greedy bankers at UBS, Merrill Lynch, Credit Suisse, Citibank, and the Bank of America. When that day comes, who will bail out profligate America? And most importantly, where will you be then? Isn't it about time you moved some of your cash and assets offshore to a country where it and you will be safe rather than sorry? And he gives a plug for the Sovereign Investor. And I cover a number of those. So I wanted to use that as an opportunity to segue to the main topic of the night, and that is rigged markets, because I think that's so important to look at these rigged markets. There's three markets I want to look at. We're going to start off with the bond market. Now, this market, this is the 10-year note, 10-year government note, and you can see it's pretty clear we're at an all-time high. The rally, if you remember this time period here in 1982, this was the Volcker economy. These were the Volcker interest rates. This is where Paul Volcker ratcheted up short-term and long-term rates up to nearly 20% across the board. It was a great time for some investors. I know my parents locked in some 30-year bonds at nearly 20%, a fantastic investment. So Volcker was very serious about killing off inflation, and that did happen. Now, what happened in the rest of the Reagan administration with the beginning of deficit spending was tragic, but they actually faced up to the fact of what needed to be done with the interest rates. Now, if you look at where we're at now, the interest rates are at historic lows, and this has nothing to do with the free market. This buying in this market is the government. This is the government essentially printing money, Operation Twist, whatever you want to call it. If we go back to a more telling interest rate would be you could use the euro dollar. I don't think we have the T-bill rate on here, so we'll just go ahead and use the 3-month euro dollar, which is very similar to the T-bill rate. Now, when you hit 100 on this instrument, your interest rate is 0. So you can see that they have suppressed interest rates to nearly 0, 99.5. So 0.5%, if you're lucky, 99.753, so 0.25%. So they've basically killed off interest rates. So this is the first example of a rigged market. Clearly, this market is rigged. This is not free market participants who are voting with their dollars and deciding what's worth their investment monies. This is just the government rigging a market. The second market I wanted to take you to is one that I've been covering fairly steadily because the Bank of Japan has intervened to support the dollar. This is the US dollar Japanese yen chart. And as I predicted, when we reached 76, I predicted we would get government intervention, which we did. We had central bank intervention there and there and there. And now we have kind of a stealth intervention. They didn't admit until about here that they were actually intervening. Again, this is a rigged market. Why are they rigging the market? Because the economic reality would tell you that the dollar should go down much, much lower than it is, but they're working with their friends in Japan to have them print money to prop up the dollar. And of course, the last market we want to look at, the most important market, is the silver market. And this is, in my opinion, the most rigged market of all markets. We have enormous outstanding short positions against the silver price, and we had the tremendous May smackdown, and we're looking to come back into this flag formation and rise to silver should probably be at 150 on the government's inflation index, maybe 250 to 350 on some honest M3 or shadow stats statistics, and based on supply and demand and fundamentals and use in the industry, probably nearly $1,000 an ounce. Now, the government knows that if these things happened, once silver gets above $50 and starts to run, then of course the price is still so dirt cheap there that the general public is going to pile in to the greatest investment in the last 10 years, and obviously will be the greatest investment in the last 20 years. So the question is, why? Why do we have these rigged markets? Well, the bottom line is that the governments of the world, but specifically the United States government, they are running a scam. And that's outlined with this Sovereign Investor article. And they are trying to rig markets so that their scam is not exposed. That's why they're in the business of manipulating prices. The reason why that is so egregious is because they purport to be believers in democracy. Now, it's my opinion that even more important than your political vote is your economic vote, where you spend your dollars. And if we had honest markets, and if we had honest governments that would allow the prices to go where the people spent their money and didn't have them trying to manipulate those, if we had interest rates based upon people's assessment of risk, if we had banks, their assets determined by people's assessment of what they're worth, if we had stocks and bonds and gold and silver determined, the prices determined by people's votes with their dollars in a real market, then obviously the prices of these things would be very different, and it would be a very large vote of no confidence against the management of the United States Congress and the President and what they've done with our budget. So that's the reason why you have rigged markets. That's why the government doesn't want markets to tell you the message that they're really sending, and that's why they're out there printing money and using that printed money and debt to manipulate markets so you don't get the message that the markets are sending, and that is that the United States is heading to the greatest catastrophe probably in the history of the world since the collapse of the Roman Empire. And we'll talk to you next time.